Thank you for joining us today. You're about to spend the next 50 minutes with us, and that gift of your time means more than you might realize. It's amazing how the smallest acts, like sharing a story that moves you, can create ripples that grow into waves of change. Every time you tell a friend about these tales, you're helping to weave a web of connection that grows stronger with each telling. We believe in the power of stories to transform, to mend spirits, and to remind us we're all connected in ways we can't always see but can certainly feel. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. Until we meet again, keep sharing, keep caring, and keep listening. The listening lamp flickers to life, illuminating the space between worlds. Here, science whispers to spirit, and reality bends to imagination. Curl up in the cosmic glow as we unveil the extraordinary hidden within the ordinary. The Price of Bread, a short story written by Rob Corrigan, narrated by Elizabeth Edwards.
Eleanor Whitman's hands knew the weight of bread better than any scale. After 40 years at Register 3 of Morton's family grocery, she could tell you the exact moment a loaf went stale just by how it settled in her palm. More importantly, she could read the stories written in how people placed that bread on her conveyor belt, set down with careful reverence by those who had counted every penny to afford it, tossed carelessly by those who never had to worry about the price. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar midnight song as she counted out her drawer, each denomination sorted with methodical precision. The store had been closed for 30 minutes, but she always stayed late to balance her register, to make her mistakes. $2.13 short, she murmured, though her count was perfect, as it had been every night for 4 decades. She opened the secret drawer beneath her register, the one known only to her and Mr. Morton before he passed, and pulled out exact change to cover the difference. The money would find its way back to those who needed it most, slipped quietly into their grocery bags, or subtracted from their totals through careful errors that never quite made it into the official records. Today it had been the Wilson boy's lunch money that came up short. She'd seen him counting coins in his palm, trying to make them multiply through sheer force of will. His father's factory injury had turned their lives inside out, and pride kept them from accepting direct help. But a mistake in their favour? That was something they could live with. The night pressed against the store's wide windows, and Eleanor felt, rather than saw, someone watching. She looked up to find a man standing just beyond the glass, distinguished, elderly but straight-backed, wearing a suit that belonged to another era. His silver-headed cane caught the store's fluorescent light and reflected it back somehow wrong, like moonlight on deep water. Their eyes met through the glass, and Eleanor felt a jolt of recognition, though she knew she'd never seen him before. He nodded, a gesture so slight it might have been imagination, and smiled. The expression made her think of her late husband Thomas, and the bargain she'd made all those years ago when the doctors had said nothing more could be done. The memory hit her like a physical blow, the weight of that choice, the price she hadn't understood until it was too late. She blinked, and the man was gone, leaving only his reflection, which lingered for a moment longer than it should have before fading into the dark. Eleanor's hands trembled as she closed her drawer. The store felt different suddenly. The familiar aisles stretched somehow longer, the shadows between them deeper. Even the gentle hum of the refrigeration units had taken on a different tone, like distant voices discussing matters just beyond her hearing. She gathered her coat and purse, her movements slower than usual. Something was changing. She could feel it in the air, in the way the prices on the shelves seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them, in the weight of all the stories she'd witnessed from behind her register. The door chimed as she prepared to leave, though she was certain she'd locked it. She turned to find the distinguished gentleman standing in the entrance, holding a single loaf of bread. "I believe," he said, his voice like well-worn velvet, "you're still open." It wasn't a question. Eleanor felt the weight of choice settle around her shoulders as she moved back toward Register 3. She knew about bargains with well-dressed strangers, knew their price. But she also knew the weight of bread in desperate hands, the mathematics of survival, the quiet dignity of those fighting to feed their families. She had spent 40 years calculating the cost of mercy. "Of course," she said, settling behind her register one more time. "I always have time for one more customer." The door swung shut behind him, and somewhere in the store, a clock began ticking backwards. The bread was fresh baked, though Morton's ovens had been cold for hours. Its warmth seeped through Eleanor's fingers as she weighed it, the scale's digital display flickering between numbers that didn't quite add up. The distinguished gentleman placed his leather ledger on the counter while he searched his pockets for payment, and Eleanor caught a glimpse of names written in impossible ink that seemed to move like mercury. "You're thinking of Thomas," he said, not looking up from his search. "The bargain you made in '83. The memory surfaced like a drowning man. Thomas in his hospital bed, the doctors shaking their heads, the stranger in the hallway who'd offered her a different kind of prescription. She'd agreed so quickly, not understanding that saving a life meant more than just preventing death. "He lived another 20 years, Eleanor said softly. But he was never quite there, like something essential had been traded away with the cancer. "Transactions require balance." The gentleman's coins clicked against her counter, each one ringing with a tone that made the fluorescent lights flicker. "As you well know with your own small adjustments to the books." Heat crept up Eleanor's neck. "Those aren't the same." "No." He opened his ledger, and she saw her careful mistakes, listed in perfect detail, 40 years of minor mercies added up into a sum that made her breath catch. Every debt must be balanced, Mrs. Whitman, one way or another. The store felt larger suddenly, the space between aisles stretching into darkness. Through the windows, Eleanor could see the Wilsons' car still in the parking lot. Tommy Wilson slumped against the passenger window, while his father argued with the tow truck driver. Another payment they couldn't afford. "They're good people," she said, though he hadn't asked. "Just caught in a bad moment." "Most are." His pen moved across the ledger, the ink catching light like fresh blood. "That's what makes the mathematics of mercy so complex." Eleanor thought of all the families she'd watched struggle over her decades at Register 3. The careful calculations of poverty, which bill to pay, which meal to skip, which dream to defer. She'd done what she could with her small adjustments, her careful errors, but it never seemed enough. "There are other ways to balance the books," the gentleman said, as if reading her thoughts. He tapped a name in his ledger, Martin Grayson, the factory owner who'd denied workers' comp for Tommy's father. "Some can afford to give more than others." Understanding bloomed like frost. "You're offering to help them." "I'm offering a transaction." He closed the ledger with a snap that echoed longer than it should have. "One that requires only your cooperation." "And what would that mean exactly?" His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Simply, don't interfere, don't warn them, don't make your little adjustments to offset the balance." He lifted the bread, its crust now somehow gold in the fluorescent light. "Let the scales find their natural level." Eleanor thought of Thomas, of the hollow look that had replaced his smile after her bargain. Thought of Tommy Wilson and his father, of all the others whose names might be written in that mercury ink. "And if I refuse?" "Then I'll find another register." He tucked the ledger under his arm. "Another calculator of small mercies. The books must be balanced, Mrs. Whitman, with or without your help." The bread rang up at exactly $0.00, though Eleanor hadn't touched the register keys. The gentleman took his receipt with a small bow and walked into the darkness beyond the store's lights. Through the windows, Eleanor watched Tommy Wilson wake up as his father's car miraculously turned over. Their relief was visible even at this distance, but she noticed how the fluorescent light seemed to pass through them now, as if something substantial had already been subtracted from their existence. She opened her secret drawer, no longer certain of its purpose. The weight of 40 years of careful mistakes pressed down on her like judgment. Outside, a car's headlights swept across the parking lot, briefly illuminating the gentleman as he approached another late-night store, another register, another set of calculations waiting to be made. Eleanor's hand moved to her own ledger, hidden beneath the counter, where she'd kept her own careful count of debts and payments. But for the first time in 40 years, she wasn't sure which column to mark. Eleanor began noticing the patterns 3 days after the gentleman's visit. Mrs. Chen, who'd always counted out exact change for her groceries, suddenly paid with crisp $100 bills. The same week, Martin Grayson's wife started using food stamps, her designer purse replaced by something from the discount store. The mathematics of it were precise, every gain matched by an equal loss, every blessing balanced by a curse. Through her register passed the evidence of lives transformed, fortunes reversed with the cruel efficiency of double-entry bookkeeping. "Your credit card was declined," Eleanor said carefully to Mrs. Grayson, watching her face flush as she dug through her purse. She made a show of running it again, her fingers deliberately hitting the wrong keys. "Oh, my mistake. It went through." The gentleman appeared behind her in line, a fresh loaf of bread in his hands. His eyes met Eleanor's, and she felt the cost of her interference settle into her bones. A strand of her hair turned silver, falling across her register display. "Such a waste," he said when he reached her counter, "to spend your own time on those who've earned their debits." "Nobody earns hunger," Eleanor replied, thinking of the hollow look in Mrs. Grayson's eyes, the same look Thomas had carried after their bargain. She'd learned to recognize it now, that subtle absence that marked those who'd been part of the gentleman's transactions. She began her quiet campaign of resistance. Wrong addresses murmured to him at checkout. Receipts smudged so names became illegible. Small miscalculations that delayed his precise mathematics just long enough for warnings to be whispered, for preparations to be made. Each interference aged her a little more. Grey threads appeared in her hair like silver rain. Lines deepened around her eyes, as if carved by time's own chisel. But she noticed how those she managed to warn carried a bit more weight to their presence, kept a bit more light in their eyes. The gentleman seemed more amused than annoyed by her efforts. "You're borrowing against your own balance," he said one night, his ledger open to show her dwindling numbers. "Time is a finite resource." "Maybe," Eleanor answered, ringing up his bread, "but mercy isn't." She thought she'd found a way to work around his mathematics, to soften the cruel equations of his cosmic bookkeeping. But then she saw Tommy Wilson's name written in that mercurial ink, the numbers beside it, calculating worth against want, need against cost. The boy had been getting thinner, his father's injury keeping them both trapped in poverty's sharp arithmetic. They needed help, the kind of help Eleanor's small adjustments couldn't provide, the kind only a terrible bargain could afford. "You can't," she whispered to the ledger, though its owner hadn't appeared tonight. "He's just a child." But she remembered being just a wife, making just a deal, trying to save just a life. Remembered how the word just could contain multitudes of consequence. Eleanor closed her register, her hands shaking as she counted out the night's mistakes. In her secret drawer, The careful records of 40 years of small mercies stared back at her. But for the first time, she wondered if mercy had its own hidden cost. If every act of kindness drew from a limited well that must eventually run dry. Through the windows, she watched Tommy and his father counting coins in their car, trying to make mathematics perform miracles. The gentleman's ledger sat closed on her counter, though she didn't remember him leaving it. Its cover gleamed like wet ink, waiting for her to make her calculations, to decide what price she was willing to let others pay. Outside, the night pressed close against the glass, and somewhere in its darkness, accounts were being balanced with terrible precision. Eleanor's interference became more deliberate after she saw Tommy's name. She developed a complex system of warnings, expired coupons slipped into specific hands, receipt paper that somehow smudged only certain names, whispered words that carried more weight than their syllables should allow. But each intervention carved its price into her flesh. She watched her reflection age weeks between customers, saw decades settle into her joints like rust. The gentleman's amusement had soured into something sharper. "Let me show you," he said one night, laying his ledger open across her register. "Watch what happens when you disrupt the balance." The pages rippled like disturbed water, and suddenly Eleanor could see the full equations of her meddling. Mrs. Chen's newfound prosperity had come from the Graysons, yes, but their loss had pushed them to sell their factory at a discount to a company that would have provided better benefits, including coverage for Tommy's father. Her intervention had prevented that domino from falling. "Every adjustment," he said, turning pages that whispered like dying leaves, "creates ripples, changes what might have been into what must now be." "You're saying their suffering would have led to something better?" Eleanor's voice cracked. "That's cruel mathematics. Crueler than watching a child waste away because you couldn't bear to let others feel temporary pain." His pen traced Tommy's name, the mercury ink catching light like tears. Sometimes mercy requires a surgeon's precision, not a grandmother's comfort. The truth of it settled into her bones, adding another layer of age to her shoulders. She thought of Thomas in those final years, not just the hollowness, but the moments of almost joy, the ghost of who he'd been surfacing briefly before sinking back into whatever emptiness her bargain had created. Through the store window, she watched the Wilsons' car sputter to a stop in the parking lot. Tommy's father gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, while Tommy pretended to sleep so his dad wouldn't see him crying. They needed more than her small mercies now, more than careful miscalculations could provide. "Stop," she said quietly, closing the ledger. "I'll stop interfering." The gentleman smiled, but his eyes held something like pity. "Too late, I'm afraid. You've already spent too much of your own time trying to reshape the equations. The balance must be restored." He reached across the counter and touched her cheek with fingers that burned cold as frost. Eleanor felt decades slide away from her like water, pooling at her feet before flowing out into the night. She gasped, suddenly stronger, suddenly younger. But the weight of what that restored time would cost squeezed her heart like a fist. "No," she started, but he was already turning away, his ledger tucked beneath his arm. "Watch now," he said without looking back. "Watch what happens when the books are properly balanced." That night, Eleanor saw the true cost of cosmic accounting. The Graysons lost everything, but the factory sold at last. Mrs. Chen's prosperity evaporated, but her grandson received a scholarship. A dozen lives transformed, 100 equations balanced with terrible beauty. And Tommy grew weaker, each breath a calculation between survival and surrender. Eleanor counted her register with shaking hands, the numbers blurring through tears. Her restored youth felt like a mockery, payment for her agreement to watch lives be broken and remade according to the gentleman's cold mathematics. But as she sorted bills worn soft with time and desperation, a different kind of calculation began forming in her mind. Because what the gentleman hadn't noticed was how her secret drawer now contained 40 years of cancelled cheques, small mercies that had created their own kind of compound interest. She looked at her reflection in the dark window, younger but somehow harder, like time hadn't been restored so much as redistributed. Outside, the night held its breath, waiting to see what she would do with this terrible knowledge, this burdensome gift. Eleanor opened her drawer and began to count. Not money this time, but possibilities. Not mistakes, but deliberate choices. Because maybe there was a different kind of mathematics, one that could transform subtraction into multiplication, loss into legacy. She just had to figure out the right equation. The truth about Thomas came to Eleanor in fragments, like a reflection pieced together from broken glass. She found his old notebook tucked behind Register 3, pages filled with increasingly confused entries about the time he'd lost. Not just years, something more fundamental. "Can't feel the sun anymore," he'd written in shaky script. "Can't taste food. Can't remember if I ever did. Something's been subtracted, but I don't know what." The gentleman appeared as she read, his shadow falling across the pages. "He knew," he said softly. "Near the end he understood the true cost." "What did you take from him?" Eleanor's voice cracked. "Not just his illness, what else? The ability to fully experience life?" He set his ever-present loaf of bread on the counter. "A fair trade for extending it, wouldn't you say? After all, you asked to save his life. You never specified its quality." The casual cruelty of his mathematics struck Eleanor like a physical blow. She thought of Thomas in those final years, going through the motions of living without truly feeling alive. She'd given him time, but stolen his ability to enjoy it. "And now," the gentleman continued, opening his ledger, "about young Tommy." "No." Eleanor's hands gripped the counter. "I won't let you hollow him out." "My dear, you misunderstand. I'm offering you a chance to save him properly this time." His pen traced Tommy's name. "A clean equation, no hidden subtractions, just a simple transfer of fortune from those who can spare it to one who needs it desperately." Through the window, Eleanor watched Tommy help his father into their car, the boy's own movements growing slower each day. The factory's new owners had finally approved the workers' comp claim, but the money wouldn't arrive in time, not without intervention. "What's the real price?" she asked. The gentleman smiled. "Simply allow me to restore balance to all the equations you've disrupted. Let me complete all the transactions you've interfered with." He gestured to his ledger. "See? The Graysons' loss becomes the factory workers' gain. Mrs. Chen's reversed fortune becomes her grandson's future. A dozen lives adjusted, and from those adjustments, enough excess fortune to save one small boy." Eleanor felt the weight of 40 years of careful mistakes pressing down on her. Every small mercy she'd calculated, every tiny adjustment she'd made to help others survive. She'd thought she was being kind, but had she just been disrupting some greater balance? "Think of it," he pressed, "all those accounts properly settled, everything in its rightful place, and Tommy, healthy and whole, with all his capacity for joy intact." The offer hung in the air between them, tempting as forbidden fruit. Eleanor looked at her reflection in the dark windows, still young from the gentleman's earlier payment, but with something harder in her eyes. She thought of Thomas, of all she hadn't understood about cosmic mathematics, about the true weight of choices, and suddenly she saw it, the flaw in his equations, the space between his numbers, where something essential had been overlooked. because mercy wasn't a finite resource to be divided and subtracted. It was more like a seed that, properly planted, could grow into something larger than its origins. "No," she said again, but differently this time. "I won't help you balance your books because your mathematics is wrong." The gentleman's smile faded. "Wrong?" Eleanor pulled out her secret drawer, filled with 40 years of careful records. "You see debits and credits, gains and losses, but there's another kind of accounting." Her hands moved across her papers with growing certainty. "I just needed to understand the real numbers." Outside, Tommy helped his father start their struggling car. The boy's own time might be running out, but watching him support his father with such care, Eleanor finally understood what her small mercies had really been creating all these years. Not just help, but hope. Not just charity, but change. The gentleman's ledger lay open on her counter, his terrible mathematics gleaming like mercury in the fluorescent light. But Eleanor had begun her own calculations now, and for the first time she could see how all her small mistakes might add up to something larger than even his cosmic bookkeeping could contain. She just had to be brave enough to change the equation entirely. The changes rippled through Morton's like waves through still water. Eleanor watched as her small defiance of the gentleman's mathematics affected the delicate balance he'd created. Mrs. Chen's prosperity flickered like a candle in wind, some days rich, others poor, as if reality itself couldn't decide which ledger to honour. Tommy grew weaker. Eleanor could see it in the careful way he helped his father navigate the aisles, in how he leaned against their shopping cart when he thought no one was watching. The factory's insurance money remained tangled in red tape, caught between the gentleman's equations and Eleanor's interference. "You're killing him," the gentleman said, appearing beside Register 3 with his customary loaf. "Your stubbornness costs more than just your own time now." Eleanor's hands showed her price, liver spots blooming like bruises, veins rising beneath paper-thin skin. She felt ancient, stretched thin across too many moments. But she continued her quiet resistance, watching how it affected the gentleman's careful calculations. "Look," he commanded, opening his ledger. "See what your interference has done." The pages showed her a terrible mathematics, how each of her small mercies had created ripples that disrupted his larger equations. The Graysons' fortune hung in balance, neither lost nor saved. Mrs. Chen's grandson's scholarship flickered between granted and denied. 100 lives suspended between what was and what might be. "The accounts must balance," he insisted firmly. "It's the law of existence itself." But Eleanor had begun to see something else in the numbers. Beneath the surface calculations, a different pattern emerged. When Mrs. Chen's prosperity faltered, her neighbours brought food. When the Graysons struggled, their former employees offered help. Small kindnesses multiplied like compound interest. "You're right," Eleanor said, watching Tommy through the window as he helped an elderly woman with her groceries, despite his own weakness. "The accounts must balance. But you're using the wrong mathematics." The gentleman's face hardened. "There is no other mathematics." "There is." Eleanor opened her drawer, pulled out 40 years of careful records. "I've been calculating it all along. I just didn't understand what I was creating." She showed him her own ledger, not debits and credits but connections, how one small mercy led to another, how help given created help returned. The numbers spiraled outward, growing larger with each transaction, defying his zero-sum calculations. "Impossible," he whispered, but she saw doubt flicker in his ancient eyes. Through the window, Tommy stumbled. The old woman he'd helped caught him, held him up. Around them, other customers moved forward, offering support, creating a moment of grace that spread through the store like light through crystal. Eleanor felt the cost of her defiance settle deeper into her bones. Grey hair fell across her register as years slipped away from her, but she watched how her small mercies had grown into something larger, a community that caught each other when they fell. "Your equations only work if everyone stays isolated," she said softly, "if every transaction stands alone. But that's not how mercy works. It multiplies, it grows." The gentleman's ledger trembled in his hands. Outside, Tommy's father's car finally broke down completely. But instead of disaster, Eleanor watched as neighbours appeared with offers of rides, mechanics emerged with tools, a network of small kindnesses activated by need. "This changes nothing," the gentleman said, but his voice held a note of uncertainty. "The books must still balance." "Yes," Eleanor agreed, feeling time itself grow thin around her as she fought his mathematics with her own. "But maybe there's a different way to count." The fluorescent lights flickered as two forms of cosmic accounting battled in the space between moments. And somewhere in that battle, Eleanor felt something begin to shift, not just in the equations, but in the very nature of balance itself. She just hoped she could hold out long enough to prove her calculations correct. The confrontation came at midnight, when the barrier between one day's accounts and another's grew thin. The gentleman appeared not at Register 3, but behind it, invading Eleanor's sacred space with his ledger open in his hands. "Enough," he said, mercury ink swirling across his pages like angry snakes. "This experiment in alternative accounting ends tonight." Eleanor stood her ground, though she felt time itself trying to dissolve her, age spreading through her bones like frost on glass. Her drawer lay open between them, 40 years of careful records glowing with a subtle light that matched the power of his cosmic books. "Look," she said, pointing to her calculations. "Really look. Not at the individual numbers, but at what they've become." Around them, the store's air grew heavy with possibility. In its depths, Eleanor could see the shimmer of all her small mercies, connecting and multiplying like stars being born. Each tiny act of kindness had created others, spreading outward in ever-growing circles of grace. "Fascinating," he admitted, studying the pattern, "but ultimately irrelevant. The universe requires balance, precise mathematics. Your emotional equations disrupt the very fabric of existence." "No," Eleanor said, understanding blooming like dawn. "They don't disrupt it, they expand it." She showed him what she'd discovered, how every small mercy created more space in the universe, how kindness could multiply without diminishing its source. Her records showed not just transactions, but transformations. "Impossible," he whispered, but she saw the mercury ink in his ledger ripple with uncertainty. "Look at Tommy," she said softly. Through the windows they could see the boy in his father's car. He was dying. The gentleman's mathematics made that clear. But around him, the community had gathered. People whose lives Eleanor had touched over decades, brought food, offered rides, shared resources. Their kindness created a web of light that pushed back against the darkness of cosmic accounting. "Your ledger demands that someone lose for another to gain," Eleanor continued. "But what if that's not the only way? What if mercy can create something from nothing, like yeast rising in bread?" The gentleman's hands trembled on his book. "There must be balance," he insisted. "A price must be paid." "Yes," Eleanor agreed, feeling time's weight pressing down on her like mountains. "But what if I could show you a different kind of price, a different kind of balance?" She laid out her proposal, not a bargain this time, but a transformation, a new system that would keep the books balanced while allowing for growth, for change, for hope. "You're offering to pay the difference yourself," he said, understanding dawning in his ancient eyes. "To become, what, an accountant of mercy?" "A calculator of different sums," she corrected, even as she felt years slipping away from her like water. Someone who helps others understand the true mathematics of kindness. The gentleman studied her calculations, his own cosmic mathematics wavering as it encountered her quiet proofs. The cost would be enormous, he warned, more than just time or life. You'd have to become something else entirely. I know, Eleanor said, thinking of Thomas, of Tommy, of all the souls whose equations had brought her to this moment. But some prices are worth paying if you understand exactly what you're buying. Outside, Tommy's light flickered like a candle in wind. Around him, the community's web of kindness glowed stronger, pushing back against the darkness with a power that even the gentleman's ledger had to acknowledge. The air grew thick with possibility as two forms of cosmic accounting faced each other across Register 3. Eleanor felt reality itself holding its breath, waiting to see which mathematics would prove stronger, the cold equations of balance or the warm calculations of mercy. The gentleman closed his ledger, opened it, closed it again. Show me, he said finally, show me these new sums. And Eleanor began to explain, even as time itself reshaped around her words, transforming them both into something that neither had quite imagined possible. The night deepened, the calculations continued, and somewhere in the space between darkness and dawn, a new kind of accounting began to take shape. The transformation began with bread. Eleanor took the gentleman's loaf, eternally fresh, eternally warm, and broke it into pieces. Each fragment multiplied as she passed it out, not through miracle but through the simple mathematics of sharing. "Watch," she told him, as Mrs. Chen received her piece and immediately divided it with the woman behind her in line. That woman shared with the Graysons, who, despite their own troubles, offered portions to others. The bread never seemed to diminish, though Eleanor could see the cost written in the silver threading through her hair, the deepening lines around her eyes. "Impossible," the gentleman murmured, but his ledger had begun to glow with a different kind of light. The new system spread through Morton's like yeast through dough. People who received help pledged to give it in other forms. The Graysons, humbled by hardship, opened their home to others struggling with medical bills. Mrs. Chen's teaching transformed lives one English lesson at a time. Even Tommy, between gasping breaths, found ways to contribute, his small kindnesses multiplying like stars. Eleanor felt herself changing as the system took root. Her body aged decades between transactions, but something else grew stronger. She could see the connections now, not just the debits and credits, but the whole living web of give and take. Each small mercy created ripples that returned as waves. "The books," the gentleman protested, though his voice held more wonder than objection. "They're completely—" He stopped, staring at his ledger, where mercury ink had begun to form new patterns, more organic than his rigid columns. "Not unbalanced," Eleanor corrected gently, "just balanced differently." She showed him how each transaction created space for more, how mercy multiplied without diminishing its source. The mathematics was complex but undeniable, a cosmic accounting that acknowledged both cost and growth. Tommy's father started their car one morning to find it mysteriously repaired. The mechanic refused payment, asking only that they help others when they could. The insurance money finally arrived, transformed by its delay into something more valuable than mere funds. It became seed for further kindnesses. Eleanor's register became more than a point of transaction. People came to her with offers and needs, and she helped them find each other, calculate the true exchange rates of kindness. Her drawer filled not with money but with promises kept, connections made, lives transformed. The gentleman watched it all, his ancient face softening as his cosmic mathematics encountered her earthly equations. "You're creating something new," he said finally. "Something that shouldn't be possible." "No," Eleanor corrected, feeling time reshape itself around her bones. "I'm just remembering something very old, something about loaves and fishes, about bread broken and shared." Tommy began to heal, not through miracle, but through the accumulated kindness of a community that had learned to calculate in mercy rather than money. His father's injury improved as stress eased and help arrived freely given. The Graysons found wealth again, but of a different kind than before. Eleanor's hair turned fully silver, her face lined with decades of compressed time, but her eyes held a light that matched the gentle glow of her records, of the community she'd helped create. Each transaction aged her, yet each one made her stronger in ways that defied ordinary accounting. The gentleman closed his ledger finally, tucking it away with a strange smile. "Well," he said, "it seems I have some recalculating to do." He paused, studying her with ancient eyes. "You understand what you've become?" Eleanor nodded, feeling the weight of her new role settle around her like a familiar coat. She was no longer just a clerk, not quite human anymore, but something else, a calculator of different sums, a keeper of Mercy's books. Outside Morton's, the community continued its quiet work of transformation. Inside, Register 3 hummed with power that had nothing to do with electricity, and Eleanor stood at her post, watching old equations reshape themselves into new possibilities, one small mercy at a time. The mathematics had changed, the accounts still balanced, but now they balanced up. Years flowed through Eleanor like water through a sieve, but time had become a different kind of currency at Register 3. Her hair remained silver, her face lined with accumulated transactions, yet she persisted, neither young nor old, but somewhere in between, like twilight made flesh. The gentleman still visited, though his ledger now matched the gentle glow of her records. Sometimes they compared notes, his cosmic mathematics gradually adapting to incorporate her calculations of mercy. They had become colleagues of sorts, accountants of different but complementary systems. "Show me again," he'd say, setting his loaf of bread on her counter, "how the numbers grow instead of diminish." And Eleanor would demonstrate with quiet pride how Morton's had transformed. The store had become more than a marketplace. It was an exchange where needs met offerings, where kindness circulated like its own kind of currency. Her register counted more than money now. It calculated the worth of promises kept, of help freely given, of lives changed through small mercies. Tommy, healthy and strong, worked the register next to hers, learning her special mathematics. He had his father's kind eyes and something of Eleanor's gift for seeing the true weight of things. When he counted out change, people always received exactly what they needed, though not always in forms they expected. "You've created something remarkable," the gentleman said one quiet midnight, studying the complex web of connections that filled the store like invisible light. "A perpetual motion machine of mercy." "Not perpetual," Eleanor corrected gently. "It still needs tending, calculating, balancing in its own way." She touched her silver hair, the years written in her skin. Everything has a price. I just helped people understand a different way to pay it. The community flourished under the new mathematics. The Graysons found joy in giving that their wealth had never provided. Mrs. Chen's English classes spawned a network of cultural exchange that enriched the entire neighbourhood. Even those who came to Morton's, struggling with poverty, found ways to contribute to become part of the greater sum. "But how long can you maintain it?" the gentleman asked, genuine curiosity in his ancient eyes. "Even with our adjusted calculations, entropy exists. Systems break down." Eleanor smiled, gesturing to Tommy at his register. To the others she'd taught her special mathematics. "That's why we teach, why we pass it on. The system doesn't depend on me anymore. It lives in them now, in how they calculate kindness, multiply mercy, compound hope." She opened her drawer one last time, showing him 40 years of careful records transformed into something luminous and alive. The numbers danced like stars, each small mercy connected to countless others, growing, spreading, creating space for more. "You've changed the fundamental equations," he said softly. "Not just here, but—" He gestured vaguely upward, and Eleanor understood he meant something larger than Morton's, than their city, than perhaps even this reality. "No," she said, closing her drawer gently. "I just remembered what they were supposed to be all along, what they can be again if we count things properly." The gentleman nodded slowly, tucking his ledger away. "Well then," he said, straightening his immaculate suit, "I suppose I should start recalculating other regions, other registers." He paused, studying her with something like affection. "Will you be all right?" Eleanor felt the weight of years, of transactions, of accumulated mercy pressing on her bones. But she also felt the strength of what she'd helped create, a system that could survive without her, that would continue growing, calculating, transforming lives through the mathematics of kindness. "Yes," she said simply, "the numbers add up now." He left her one last loaf of bread, still warm, still somehow fresh. Eleanor broke it carefully, sharing pieces with each customer until long past closing time. The fragments multiplied as they were divided, an ancient miracle made new through the simple mathematics of giving. Later, in the quiet of midnight, Eleanor made her final count, not of money or years or debits and credits, but of lives touched, kindnesses multiplied, mercy made manifest through countless small transactions. The numbers glowed like constellations, each point of light connected to countless others, spreading outward into infinity. She closed her register one last time, the soft chime echoing with the weight of completion. Outside Morton's, the community she'd helped create continued its quiet work of transformation. Inside, at Register 3, the mathematics of mercy waited to be calculated anew. Tomorrow, someone else would count these sums. Tonight, Eleanor's accounts were finally perfectly balanced. And somewhere in the cosmic books, in ledgers both mortal and divine, the numbers added up to exactly what they should.
Thank you for illuminating your imagination with the listening lamp. If our tale has sparked a light in your mind, we invite you to keep that flame burning. Subscribe to our podcast and join us again as we continue to explore the vast cosmos of human experience. Until next time, may your inner light guide you through the mysteries that await.